Thanks. Let me start by asking you a very personal question. How much cash do you have in your pocket right now? Go ahead, look. I'm guessing not much, right? Why is that? Well, the fact is the use of cash has been declining for decades. 50 years ago, cash was used in 80% of US domestic transactions. Today, that figure is much closer to half. Increasingly, we're relying instead on various forms of digital, mobile, and online financial platforms, everything from credit cards to iPhones. And the decline in cash isn't limited to the United States. In fact, we're not even world leaders in the decline in cash. Sweden holds that title. This is hard to believe, but even the homeless in Sweden are starting to take credit cards. That's true, absolutely true. Now, to support themselves, many homeless Swedes sell a magazine called Situation, and here's a picture of the credit card reader that they actually use to accept donations. All right? And there are declining cash occurring in plenty of other places too. For example, buses in London no longer take cash. France, this is amazing to me, France has recently banned its citizens from making cash transactions over 1,000 euros. Right? That's barely more than $1,000 these days. Right? Somaliland is one of Africa's poorest countries, but that hasn't stopped its citizens from adopting advanced digital payment systems. Cash in Somalia has become so devalued that it's almost impossible to carry enough of it around to buy almost anything. Look at this. There you go, right? The solution? Street vendors there routinely accept payments via mobile phone. Somali phone owners use their phones to make an average of 34 financial transactions a month. Now, that's more than one a day, and it's actually one of the highest rates in the world. Once you start looking for it, evidence of the decline of cash is everywhere. Just the other day, for example, my lovely wife, Linda, she's in the audience somewhere. Anyway, just the other day, my lovely wife, Linda, went to the post office to buy one stamp. Now, don't get me started about this, because who the hell goes to the post office to buy one stamp, right? Well, she's out there somewhere. She ought to raise her hand, right? That says she does. Perfect example. Anyway, so she goes to the post office, waits in this long line to buy her one stamp, and then hands the clerk a $20 bill, right? I'm not kidding. The clerk just looks at her and says, "Lady, haven't you got a credit card?" So anyway, what's driving this trend away from cash? It's being driven by the triumvirate of consumers, governments, and business. Consumers looking for convenience, governments looking for efficiency, and businesses are looking for what they always look for, profits. But the rise of the digital economy has a very dark side for one occupational group, street criminals. And that's because it's replacing cash. Believe me, no one laments the demise of cash more than drug dealers, burglars, carjackers, and armed robbers. This is my world. It is my world. I've spent my entire working life hanging out with active burglars. Active street offenders. Not in prisons and jails, but on the streets, and sometimes in my office. But please don't tell my boss, because they really won't like that. Okay? So that's what I'm doing. Why are street criminals so partial to cash? They're partial to it because it's the fuel that drives their criminality. Here's a brief lesson on the journey from birth to predatory street crime. Virtually all would-be street criminals are born into truly awful social circumstances, and they grow up witnessing plenty of violence. Here's what a local street offender has to say about his upbringing, and before I play this, I should say that the voices have been changed to protect the guilty.
I grew up with shooting and fighting all over. You're a professor. You grew up with books. Where I'm from, you never know if you're going to live 1 minute to the next. People die every day. You can go to sleep and hear gunshots all night, man, all night. Ambulances and police cars steady riding through my neighborhood, man.
Growing up in conditions like these loosens their ties to conventional society, essentially setting them adrift and making them vulnerable to the allure of street life. It's a common refrain amongst urban mothers that they fear losing their sons to the street. That's just not an irrational fear. Many of them, in fact, do end up losing their sons to the streets. The imperatives of street life call for the hedonistic pursuit of illicit action, especially hard drug use, but also illicit gambling, illicit sex, all these things that feed on themselves and constantly call for more of the same. Yeah, on the streets, the idea is to live life literally, and I'm talking literally here, literally as if there's, no tomorrow. Let's listen to another street offender here.
You living that, where you chasing dope, chasing women, chasing gambling, all that chasing, you gotta pay for it, you hear? Ain't nothing free, gotta keep that train moving, gotta keep that party going.
This kind of life can only be sustained through regular infusions of cash, which in turn can only be sustained through predatory street crime. Here's what another offender has to say about that.
Look, I ain't gonna sit around and wait for something to drop in my lap. Ain't gonna get me no job, right? Well, I gotta use my head and my 32. I need to get the real stuff, the dope and the cash. I get what I need and I just keep it going.
The problem, of course, is that as fast as offenders get their hands on more cash, they turn around and spend it with reckless abandon in this desperate attempt to quote-unquote keep the party going. But mind you, this isn't a suburban get-together over a few drinks. It's a never-ending struggle to sustain the unsustainable. Because remember, these are very poor people trying to maintain a very expensive habit. Let's listen to one last street offender, and on this occasion, I'm going to have to ask you to please excuse the language.
Just got the money to blow, so fuck it. Blow it on whatever. It don't even matter. Whatever you see, you get it. Shit wasn't yours from the giddy up, so you can't act like careful with it. Wasn't yours to care for. Easy come, easy go. Shit.
Traditionally, we tried to fight street crime by improving social conditions, but we haven't had much luck. We still have poverty, many urban schools are still a disaster, and there are still plenty of dysfunctional families. So disillusioned by our inability to reduce street crime by improving social conditions, more recently we've tried to fight a so-called war on drugs. Let me just ask you out there in the audience, does anybody out there think we've won that war? I don't see one hand. I don't see one. Okay, let me ask a different question. Does anyone out there think we have any chance of winning that war? No, I still don't see any, I don't see any hands at all. Okay, anyway, in thinking about this, I started to wonder whether we've been focusing on the wrong thing. Now, I grew up in Southern California, which is fire country. And one thing I know about fire is that if you want to fight it effectively, you have to starve it of fuel. Well, cash is the fuel on which street crime burns. So maybe we should focus our crime prevention efforts there by getting rid of cash. In a lot of high crime neighborhoods, a lot of the cash on the street used to come from welfare payments. People got a welfare check, and because most of them didn't have a bank account, they'd end up cashing that check at a local check cashing place and then carrying the money around with them in their pockets. And you know what? Then something interesting happened. In the mid-1990s, the federal government decided to streamline the welfare payment system. Congress mandated that every state had to replace welfare checks with debit cards by moving to a program called EBT. Now, for welfare recipients, this meant no more walking around with a pocket full of cash because the card itself could be used to make payments. So what's great about this is it meant that, the EBT program removed a certain amount of the cash circulating on the streets in high crime neighborhoods. Now, I was living in Missouri when the changeover happened there. Missouri didn't roll out their EBT program all at once. Instead, they implemented it a few counties at a time, starting in 1997. That was great news for me and my colleagues, because it allowed us to compare the counties before and after the change was made to see what happened to street crime. I'm not going to keep you in suspense. The implementation of the EBT program led to about a 10% drop in street crime. That's a pretty big drop. It was almost immediate, and that's a pretty big drop. Very few initiatives, crime prevention initiatives, lead to any kind of 10% drop like that, right? Now, to put this in perspective, in Georgia, that would mean 8,700 fewer burglaries and 22,000 fewer thefts each and every year. And remember, the EBT program didn't remove all of the cash from these high crime neighborhoods, just some of it. Imagine what would happen to street crime if cash disappeared altogether. I don't know what's going on over there. They're building something. Anyway, as one street criminal recently tried to explain to me, Rich, if they get rid of cash, there won't be no way for the non-working man to make a living. It's very Dickensian, right? I love it. Anyway, the streets aren't a world of debit and credit cards, right? They just aren't, because electronic transactions are traceable. Cash, on the other hand, is uniquely liquid, anonymous, and most importantly, untraceable, which makes it perfect for crime. And you know what? You can see the relationship between cash and crime at work in other areas in the world too. For example, as a result of a series of loan defaults and steep inflation, Argentinians lost faith in the banking system and started carrying large amounts of cash around with them, right? So there was more cash on the street, and with the Argentinian economy in absolute turmoil, there was more incentive to take that cash too. I don't think any of you out there in the audience are going to be very surprised to hear that robbery rates there skyrocketed. Now, nearby in Uruguay, they instituted a so-called conditional cash transfer program for families living below the poverty line. Now, that program was a little bit different. What happened there was that they paid parents in return for keeping their kids in school and making sure that they got regular health care. And they paid the parents in cash, which meant that there was more cash circulating on the streets in these poor neighborhoods. In many ways, this turned out to be a wonderful program. Kids stayed in school, and they got regular health care. Unfortunately, robbery and theft rates there skyrocketed too, which was too bad. Interestingly, Brazil, which is right next to Uruguay, also instituted a conditional cash transfer program at about the same time, and yet experienced no increase in crime whatsoever. What was the difference? Brazil didn't pay the parents in cash. Instead, they deposited the funds directly into a bank account for them. The past 20 years has witnessed an unprecedented drop in street crime. Here's what that drop looked like in the United States. Notice that it begins right in the middle of the 1990s, right? Just at the same time that the EBT program was being introduced across the country. I don't think that's a coincidence, right? But my question for you today is this: did crime really drop? Do you think it really dropped? The evidence suggests that the decreased use of cash and the increased use of debit and credit cards actually has been a double-edged sword when it comes to crime. On the one hand, it's definitely helped to reduce street crime. But at the same time, it's made cybercrime possible. Think Target, think TJ Maxx, or think the mother of all cybercrimes, Sony Pictures, right? So what we really have here appears to be more of a crime shift, not a crime drop, right? In other words, the transition from cash to digital transactions has changed the nature of crime itself. And they're changing it more and more all the time. But it's done more than that. It's also changing its offenders and victims, right? Now let me ask you out there in the audience, I gotta shade my eyes to ask this question here. How many of you have ever been robbed at gunpoint? Hands up. Hands up. Okay, one. I see one. I see one. Maybe two. Yeah, several. Okay, a few. I see a few. There's a few. Okay, let me ask another question. How many of you have ever had your credit card information stolen? Hands up. Yeah, there we go. The fact is that the real beneficiaries of the drop in street crime mostly aren't you and me. And that's because we didn't really experience that much street crime to begin with. Look how few of you have been robbed. Now, with the rise of the digital economy, right, crime victims are starting to look a lot more like the people in this auditorium. And you know what? So are the offenders. Street criminals haven't abandoned burglary, robbery, carjacking, and drug dealing for cybercrime. This is where we see the criminological impact of the so-called digital divide, with street criminals being left behind simply because they lack the technological sophistication and access to keep up. As the divide widens between the digital haves and have-nots, we're actually in the process of creating a new form of feudalism, where the poor are locked into place not only by a lack of money, but also by a lack of access to a new world of technological and financial criminal opportunities. It's weird to think of it this way, but essentially crime is a resource like any other resource. And the rich are in the process of stealing that resource from the poor, right? They really are. That's what they're doing. But the decline in cash isn't just changing crime. Ultimately, it's going to change the world, right? Just think about this. In a world without cash, what happens to undocumented workers? Think about this. How do they get paid? What happens to human trafficking? What happens to drug trafficking? What happens to income tax evasion? There's a whole shadow economy out there that runs entirely on cash. And many of us, actually probably most of us, are more dependent on that economy than we realize or would care to admit. What's going to happen to it? I have to admit, I don't really know. Are you ready for the coming cashless society? Well, I'm here to tell you better get ready for it because it's on its way and it's going to be here sooner than you think. Thanks.